Well, welcome back, everybody, to Two Pastors and a Mic. My name is Shannick,
And I'm Corey.
and we are so excited that you're joining us on the journey today as we got kind of a heavy topic to talk
Heavy.
about. But
Oh,
before
yeah.
we get there, we do want to give a shout out to a couple different people that this week, as this podcast is being released, are actually trying to get some accolades,
Milestones.
some milestones accomplished. It's not a huge deal, but in this area,
It is
Southern
in Southern
Indiana,
Indiana.
it is high school boys basketball sectional week. Actually,
Mhm.
shout out to Borden High School, who just
Yeah, the
won
women's.
the girls state championship for 1A. That was really cool. And it's right here in our area, about 15, 20 minutes away. Also, two players. One,
Two
Josh
seniors.
Renfro
Mhm.
at Christian Academy is trying to hit 2,000 points, which is wild.
Crazy.
And how many points is he away?
I think he's 30. Braden, his brother, told me he's 30 points away. Shout out to you.
30 points away. And also my nephew, Cody
Hey,
Bannett. Shout out to
Cody.
you. You are 29 points away from 1,000
Yeah.
at Pekin Eastern. So
Two great senior boys right there. A big shout out to Josh and Cody, who probably don't even listen to this. But I think Josh's dad does. So big shout out to you,
yeah,
Steve-O.
absolutely. Also, before we dive into the episode, if you haven't already, like, share, subscribe, do all the things,
Do it.
leave a review. We definitely get encouraged. And I think we're
Do
going to
it.
need some encouragement over the next month, as I said, as we talk about something that could be heavy on our hearts, heavy on your heart as you're listening. But if this podcast and this specific series that we're going to go through this month is a help to you and maybe bring some peace or enlightenment to you, we'd really love to hear about that in your journey. So would you just reach out?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about church trauma and trauma responses. Now, this has been my world in my counseling sessions over the last 2 years. This is a hot topic. I think everybody kind of uses this language. I know there's a lot of people that have these experiences, and you might be thinking, why are we talking about this? Well, this was actually something that several people reached out and asked us to talk about this topic a couple of years ago. But I recently just put out a post to get some feedback. Where do you guys want us to go? You know, we've hit 200 episodes, and several people responded with talking about church hurt or church trauma. And I was kind of hesitant too. We haven't spent any time. We're at 216 episodes in, and this is the first time really talking about this topic. And we're talking about this topic because I think we must. We have to. The power that comes from religion shapes all of us. Some for really good reasons, some for really bad reasons. And we want to be a part of the organizational side of church that helps bring healing to this conversation, giving time and space for people to process their pain and deal with their bitterness and resentment. And we've done our Next Steps class for a lot of people that have been coming to our church over the last 2 years. Really, this has been a story, probably even since COVID.
Yeah.
So for the last 5 years, really, is Hill City has become, honestly, that safe church for people to find healing from being burned out or hurt or experiencing trauma from other churches,
Right.
which is very interesting.
And not to say that we also haven't been
Sure.
a part to play in maybe other people's
Yeah,
journey of experiencing trauma or church hurt.
I'm sure. And if you're new
I'm
to
sure we have.
the Christian faith, this might be really new. We're going to unpack a lot of the things that both you and I have seen within organizational church, but also more importantly, just because of social media and news outlets, it just seems to be in the media all the time about pastors falling or this scandal or this real traumatic experience that people now have to overcome or deal with, or people walking away from the church because of this. And honestly, the reason why we're talking about it this week, and we're going to spend the next several weeks talking about specific examples of things that we believe create church trauma, but we really do hope to become a reform to this broken system, not necessarily burn the system to the ground, which a lot of people are like, let's just screw all this church stuff, which I think some of that is fair, to be honest. I know a lot of people are very upset at the church because statistically speaking, there are a lot of churches that aren't actually involved in their community doing helpful things that are necessary in their specific area of influence. But I just think we cannot dismiss the harm that the church has done over centuries. And it's time to really talk about it.
Yeah, no, we have to. And I think to get us start talking about it, we have to kind of define what spiritual abuse or church trauma really is, and how it might be a little bit different than just the phrase of church hurt.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people just throw that out flippantly and they say, I was hurt by church, but there's some direction that we want to kind of give, or some
Yeah.
foundation we want to give before we dive into that. Because yes, we believe in church trauma and some serious things that have happened, but there's also, right now in the culture we live in, a lot of people just throwing around this idea of church hurt, and we really have to also dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time over the last 2 weeks diving into this perspective from a lot of other well-known people that speak on this topic, some church, some not, clinical psychologists. And I was listening to this one guy who's got a pretty good following, and I watched one of his videos. I ended up watching like 4 of his podcast episodes, and they were all so incredible and so rich. And he was talking about the difference between church trauma and church hurt. And we're not dismissing this, but he was saying it's not helpful to use both words, because he defined it. And I kind of agreed to this to some degree, but church trauma is like real stuff that we're going to unpack here today that is abusive, manipulative, power control. Church hurt, he said, tends to oftentimes be people leaving churches because they themselves didn't know how to put up a boundary, which I thought was very interesting. Now, not to dismiss
or have a healthy expectation.
Right. Oh, yeah, that was a good one. So we're not dismissing people's church hurt, because it still is real to them and raw, but there is a massive difference between abuse and one not being able to put up a boundary, which we want to be helpful to you so that you can learn how to speak boundaries into your life and set them so that you don't experience church hurt in a given city.
Right. Because also, as people that lead a church organization, we see sometimes the other side of the perspective, and sometimes question someone calling something church hurt. And again, we're not going to dismiss any of it. We're going to dive into some very serious stuff. But as Corey was talking about the podcast that he was listening to and sharing some of this information, I was even questioning, well, then is there really a difference between church trauma and church hurt? But to get to this place, we're trying to get some understanding. I had to share a story to see if it was accurate or not. And I just want to share the story.
Sure.
Just how we unpacked, right? This is what we do, unpack our journey and learning together. But something actually triggered me a little bit several months ago. And it was someone who put out a post on Facebook, and they used to be a part of our gathering. They were in leadership. They were just really like entrenched in the family here at Hill City. Well, just through differences and through conversation, they realized that this wasn't the place that they wanted to worship at and to gather at. And so they decided to leave, which is okay. But this post, and now it's been several years since this couple had left in this family, but they just recently put out a post, and you might have seen this post like floating around social media and different things. And it says, hey, you can say hi to me and we can be friends, even if I leave your church. We're not in gangs. And I'm looking at this post and I'm triggered. I'm going to be honest. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, every time I see this couple in this family, I say hi. I still go out of my way to try to talk to them and engage with them on some type of level. They were involved in our life for quite a few years. And on the flip side of it, they ignore my text. They see me, and some people literally, I can see them make eye contact with me, and they try to go a different direction to avoid me.
And you're outgoing.
And I'm thinking, in this scenario, who's the ones that don't want to be friends with people that you've left the church? Like, I see it from the other side. So I guess then I'm thinking, oh man, am I experiencing church hurt?
I mean,
but they claiming they're experiencing church hurt. That's why it can be very touchy sometimes. Yeah. And what you said, we have to realize some of the stuff that's church hurt maybe was someone not creating a healthy boundary.
Yeah.
Or had unhealthy expectations.
I think there can be both. I don't think it's an either or, because we've experienced a lot of church hurt from people leaving. Some people leaving with valid reasons. Others, we could lift off probably 20 church family names that left, and you asked that question, but did we love you well while we were here? And every time the answer is yes. So then it's like, well, why are you leaving then? Or you going out of your way. I mean, you're the most incredible pastor, and I think I can say that to you because you actually do not only care about people, but you go and meet people's needs that can do nothing for you in return. You are a living, walking example of Jesus to me. It's why I stay here, because there's so much health, but not everybody gets to see the health, or they
Yeah.
have one experience, and that one experience is real, and then it kind of defines their journey. And so we're not dismissing that. It's just unfortunate
Yeah.
sometimes.
Well, I'll share one more thing. So, like in it, for instance, with someone leaving, I'd ask every couple and every family that always leave. I ask them, "Hey, did we love you well while you were here?"
If they have a conversation.
Yeah, if they have a
Yeah.
conversation. And I haven't had one person say no. Maybe they just don't want to share that with me or whatever. But it's always no, and over what, I can't even remember what word I'm looking for.
Overwhelming.
No, not overwhelming. Anyway, they always give the response, well, yes, absolutely. Well, one couple, it got back to me a month or two later that when they came and shared, hey, this isn't the place for us. We're going to be moving on. Okay, did we love you well? Yes, you did. Well, we wish you well on your journey. We send you out with blessings. You know, we're still engaged in connection in the community. I'll say hi to you when I see you, and all of the stuff. Well, came back to me that they were upset because they felt like I didn't fight for them to stay.
Hmm.
And I gave them freedom instead to choose. But they were upset. And they would go on to say, I would believe that I caused some type of church hurt in their life because I didn't fight for them.
Yeah, the tension. It's interesting. I'll share one from, since you're sharing stories. I personally left a church organization on staff and claimed church hurt. But now looking back 15 years, I'd be like, oh man, some of that stuff probably was church hurt, but maybe some of that stuff was me being immature, me having judgments towards decisions or the organization as a whole when I didn't actually know the full context, or just me not learning how to set a boundary. And I'm very thankful that I left because I didn't want to be a part of that toxic environment and culture. But some of the things that I was calling church trauma was really just me being immature. And again, that's not everybody's story, but so church hurt,
Yep.
church trauma, I think that was important to talk about. But I never heard that perspective until I was listening to that guy, that he said that there's a difference. But we wanted
Right.
to focus on spiritual trauma or
Yeah.
church hurt
Because it's
or
real.
church trauma.
Because it's
And
real.
and here are some definitions.
Yeah. And again, we don't want to dismiss anything
Right.
that possibly has happened to you, our listener or watcher, and your experience. And so we're going to dive into this. And so if we step away a little bit from that phrase church hurt and really dive into what we're going to call church trauma, maybe we can kind of see a little
Mhm.
bit of the difference. Again, we're learning in this
Yeah.
together. But a simple definition of church trauma is when any kind of experience in a religious context where religious environments and practices are harmful to an individual's emotional, physical, social, or financial health happen. Dr. Pandel actually gives this definition. He says spiritual abuse is the use of faith, belief, and religious institutional authority to either manipulate someone, control them, or harm them in any way. So trauma is not what happened to you, it's what happened inside of you, your internal psychological wound, because of what happened to you.
Yeah. And so I kind of been spending a lot of time thinking about this. My personal definition of spiritual abuse or church trauma would be when fear, control, and shame lead instead of love, freedom, and grace. And so here's some examples. This abuse looks like controlling your life decisions, such as relationships and finances. This is like the church above everything else. And I hear these horror stories
We've heard
on
of
a weekly basis in counseling sessions. So these are like examples I'm using of people's real stories, or a church environment that fosters a codependent spirit. So like you become codependent on the church leadership, and it's oftentimes not your doing. It's because they're the only ones that can hear God, and they're the only ones that can give direction or purpose to your life. So you have to go after and seek them, which I've seen this happen where people will come to us looking, and we're trying to teach people that the same spirit that lives in us lives in you. Like
Right.
you don't need our opinion or thought. Now, sometimes they just want our opinion, and I like that. But if it's a codependent, I will call that out, being like, hey, you are empowered too. And this often happens through manipulated prophetic words. I know you've felt that. I've had some people give me a prophetic word and I'll be like, no, that you definitely didn't hear from the Spirit. Or it can often come from a poor interpretation of the scriptures, which again, we're going to spend a whole episode on that in the coming weeks talking about that. Here's another one, which we're going to spend a whole episode talking about it, is a violent God image. And so violence becomes the necessary part of God's plan, terror, horror, fear. And so what happens is you have, I'm going to say well-meaning, it's not always the case, but you have some people that have only been taught a specific lens of God, so they continue to teach that, and they scare the crap out of people into the arms of a loving God. That is, unfortunately, the predominant gospel message in the American church, and it's not the gospel. And then lastly, and I'm sure there's a lot of other examples, but lastly, we see this because we are a church that has females in every aspect of leadership in this church, but I would say female discrimination, which I said it this past Sunday. I didn't mean to say it because it did come off condescending. I'll say it again, though, not in a condescending way, but I just do not understand any church family that wants to be a part of a church where females are not a part of church leadership.
Right.
I see, I have a friend that's in a church, and they always post about their retreats and their sermon writing retreats or their eldership gathering, and there's no women involved. And I'm like, why? And the church is huge. So it's like, why do women love to go to churches like that? Or maybe they're in an abusive relationship with their husbands, and they've just been taught this terrible submission idea that of not a mutual submission, where they just go to a male-dominated church. I'm like, you miss half of the voice of God by only having males being influenced in church leadership decisions, which is a church trauma all in of itself. But so it's one thing to experience failure, which we all do, specifically within work and our relationships. But it's another thing when you hear that you're a failure from someone who's claiming to speak for God and does something similar, giving you like, oh, you're failing in your relationships with God, or failing in your relationships because you are a failure.
Yeah.
When people
and that
hear
voice, and they take that voice as God in their life.
Yeah.
Or the people that are using it claim to be God's voice in their life.
Yeah, it's so toxic. And so I get a lot of the church trauma that happens in people's lives. And I have some that I'm still unpacking.
Yeah.
I probably have been a part of it when I've taught certain things. I've drastically changed my message. I used to be, when it came to atonement theory, I used to agree with penal substitution atonement theory, and had to drastically shift my worldview when I came out of that. And I am so glad that I don't have hundreds of YouTube videos prior to 2013. You know what I mean? Like when I was teaching that garbage. So
yeah, no, that's good. I love those definitions and what you came up with. And I think as the month goes on, we're going to kind of dive into
we're going to
some
dive
of
into
those individual ones in an even deeper level, and that's going to be fun. So church trauma impacts people differently, but there is one thing in common: relational disconnection.
Oh yeah.
So this is an emotional sense of some type of separation, whether that be with God, with others, or most importantly, yourself.
Which we're going to spend a whole episode on that.
And that's how church trauma affects through this relational disconnection. Peter Levine, he actually says this in Healing Trauma, the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The loss of connection is often hard to recognize because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly over time, and we adapt to these subtle changes, sometimes without even noticing them. These are the hidden effects of trauma, the ones most of us keep to ourselves. We may simply sense that we do not feel quite right without ever becoming fully aware of what is actually taking place. That is the gradual undermining of our self-esteem, self-confidence, feelings of well-being, and connections to life. So sometimes this thing of church trauma is slow and subtle over time.
Yeah, and it can be much more painful because of that. To be honest, I'm a part of a lot of different Facebook groups that talk a lot about church trauma. There's one, shout out to Jason Clark. He's been on our podcast. He hosts a very famous podcast, Rethinking God with Tacos. It's very helpful. I think you should check it out if you're a podcast guru and you haven't already. We've promoted that many times on our podcast. But he also moderates this Facebook group that has thousands of people. And so people have different beliefs, and it is just a wild Facebook group, to be honest. But one of the conversations was on spiritual trauma, and there were hundreds of comments. But I only noticed the post because Jason responded in the thing, and he wrote this. I'm going to read this. There's so much gold in this. But he recently said this. He said, there's a lot of journeys represented here. And he was speaking about the Facebook group, but that applies to everybody. Most, if not all, have some type of church trauma or church hurt. And most of that trauma, if not all, is connected to some form of failed leadership. Men or women who've leveraged their title, position, or theology to hide their own insecurities, desperations, and broken places. Additionally, most of us have participated in cultures and systems, church or otherwise, built upon separation, which again, we're going to spend a whole episode on that. And we did just spend a whole episode on the fact that you're not separated and have never been from God. In those cultures, you either stone the woman caught in her shame or you walk away from her. I am growing ever more sure in a third option, which is union, the one that Jesus revealed, the one that didn't pretend nothing was wrong, but didn't participate in shame or condemnation either, the one where everyone was invited into repentance, transformation, healing, freedom, and trust. As we continue to grow confident in love, I believe we can also grow in wisdom and grace, the kind needed to address the fruit of separation in our own lives and in the cultures and systems that we live in. As to my church trauma, which has become scars, and to those times I picked up a rock, I am a walking testimony of the healing, transformative love of Jesus, and I continue to lean into his kindness. I think conversations like these are important, but only helpful to the extent that we stay connected and aware of a greater love that heals and transforms. So let's lean into the third option, which again was union with God.
Right. And so now let's kind of transition now talking about the responses. I know
Yeah.
me and you spent quite a bit of time last week developing this
Yeah.
and what could be the different responses to trauma. And again, when you hear these, we came up with 6 kind of categories
Mhm.
that you could fall in. And some of them overlap each other. Some of them sound a little bit similar, but I think there's enough difference in all of them in our responses. And again, as you're hearing this from Corey and I, these are what we thought of. Sometimes either we had the response or people on our staff have had this response, or we see this a lot in church leadership and their responses.
Mhm.
And so,
or large scandals and those
Right.
responses.
right, the responses to what happened. And so this might be more for that setting, but also maybe you
I
can
think it
find
applies.
yourself in maybe any
For
one of
sure.
these as well. And so this is, again, in the context within the church and church trauma responses. First off, you have the avoider.
Mm.
That's what we're calling it, the avoider. Now, this is where you basically just stuff it all down, and you do this because what happened or the trauma or whatever it was very uncomfortable.
Mm.
And so this trauma that you just avoided and you just stuffed it down, it came out sideways in other areas, right? So this is the person that acts like, well, it didn't happen, or it did happen. No, I'm sorry, it did happen, but we're just sweeping it under the rug.
Yeah, totally avoiding.
Totally trying to avoid any kind of conversation, process, journey through it, anything. Let's just move on.
Yeah, because the second one sounds similar. This is the denier, and this is often people who are just loyal to the person who's either giving the abuse or the trauma, and they're the ones. This isn't it happened and we're sweeping it under the rug. This is refusing to
Right.
believe it happened. No,
Yeah.
this did
No,
not
it didn't happen. No, that didn't happen to
No,
you.
no, you're wrong. You're wrong, and that's very dismissive and not okay. So you got the avoider, the denier.
Yeah. Next up, we have the over spiritualizer.
Oh, my opinion, these are sometimes the worst.
Yeah. So this person, it's very hard for them to accept the pain because they just tried to, it's a little bit of the avoider because they just tried to think about ways to spiritualize or over spiritualize what happened. Like, well, God's just going to make a way through this, which we're going to talk about a whole episode about this. Or, it's okay, brother, because God's given you this as a trial to go through.
Yeah.
It's everything's back to a spiritual principle to learn instead of something to recognize where someone's going through something traumatic and they need healing, they need connection, they need time, they might need therapy.
No, they definitely do.
I'm saying, but they try to just over spiritualize everything.
Oh my gosh, like this happens we are going to take, but we've spent a lot of episodes talking about that whole, what are the common phrases in the church? Like God gives his hardest battles to his toughest soldiers, that bull crap, or,
God won't give you more than you can
oh
handle.
my gosh, trigger. Like imagine, I've actually heard it say that someone had a large platform because they now speak. They got healing from their childhood rape. And now they're out speaking about it. And someone was like, "Oh man, like look at the platform God's given you. Aren't you so glad you went through that so that you could like what? Like rape is never a part of God's will for anybody's life. Yes, you can use that once you get healing as a testimony, since 1 in every 3, I think the statistics are, or 1 in every 4 girls and 1 in every 6 boys. But that's not so that you could use it as a platform like that. That is just crazy. The third one is the controller. These people have, man, they have that super behavior mentality, especially when things are really messy. Like, oh, let's just super behave because we're trying to control the situation. We're not letting things happen naturally. Or this is like, oh, don't you dare say anything about God's anointed. Have you ever been in those cultures? Or this is where they use their leadership or power to silence or bully.
Don't talk about it.
Don't talk about it. Or when pain happens, we need space, but it's not provided, which often happens a lot. Or they'll confront gossip, which again, gossip is wrong, but they'll confront gossip to use as a control mechanism. Like, stop talking about that. So
right.
Hopefully you're not being triggered as you're listening to
and
this,
that's the fourth one.
Yeah.
The fifth one is the worker.
This is a challenge to us,
the busy bee. And I think
church staff.
Yeah. For me personally, this was the most challenging because I could see for sure this being something that that I would maybe fall into, like with some church trauma. And this is the person, the worker is, who just puts his head down and gets back to the grind, gets back to the systems, gets back to the cycle. This is someone where leadership gets together and, okay, all this stuff happened, but we have Sunday service coming up and it has to go off like it always has. And we have to do the same thing we've always done. And let's just keep that kind of system and machine going, if you will. And they distract themselves with responsibilities, with other duties, and just want to adhere to a bunch of stuff that they could do to distract themselves from probably the pain that has happened within the community.
Yeah. That's a good challenge if you're a church leadership person listening to this, is learning the pause. We talked about this of like how many church scandals happen nationwide, and instead of pausing the Sunday services, they just keep going right back onto it. Yeah, they might share some things, but what would happen to the health of your community if you learn to take a couple Sundays off? But no, we got to keep the machine going because we got bills to pay, which again, we're going to talk about that in a future episode. And lastly is the attacker. This is obviously the person who uses their anger in a violent way, not a healthy way. And so, yeah, these are the avoider, the denier, the over-spiritualizer, the controller, the worker, the attacker. These are oftentimes our trauma responses, not even just in church world. You probably have some of these responses to some of your trauma, and some of them are justified. But being able to work through them in a safe place is really important to do. So this is how we're going to close this episode, is what do you do with your church trauma and your church hurt, or whatever you want to call it, the abuse? One, stop comparing it to other people, because you do have to find a safe place. I'm going to jump ahead here, but we must create safe spaces to dialogue. When risk and vulnerability creates respect, trust goes up. But if it's not safe, you need to leave. Like, that's the most important thing, is finding a safe community for you to process and deal with. And I'm not saying we might not be it for you, but I really encourage you to find that safe space, and you will know it's safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing to do as you fall into this, or to possibly not fall into the spiritual or church trauma, is take people, especially people in leadership, off the pedestal.
Yeah.
And I know it's one thing we talk about a lot in our next steps, even as new people are learning about Hill City and the culture we've created. We tell them that an expectation that people can have from us are 4 things: love you, lead you, learn from you, but we're going to let you down. Yeah. So please take us off of any type of pedestal you may put us on. We are just 2 people, yes, trying to lead this organization, but we're empowered with the Holy Spirit, the same Spirit that lives in you. And so everyone has as much ability to do vastly amazing things for the kingdom, just like we have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
And so we want people to start taking other people off any type of pedestal.
That's a good reminder. And you have to let your emotions through without trying to either fix them or make excuses. We just did a whole series called Sitting in the Well, This language is language I use in our counseling sessions. We have a whole podcast episode called Sitting in the Well. Learning to give your emotions a voice, even if you've been told they're crazy, even if you think they're crazy, even if you don't know that they're crazy yet, you have to let your emotions have a voice.
I love that. Why don't you take the next one? Because I know this is something that your brother brought up to you in conversation.
Yeah. We have to recognize, and maybe you're listening to this and being like, wow, I didn't even realize I had church trauma or church hurt. And you're like, crap, I do. But we need to recognize and admit our spiritual wounds. Again, this is coming even back to piggyback is learning to let your emotions have a voice. But learning to view God outside of our lived experiences with his creation is very important to our healing journey. So many of us, we view God through the lens of the people that we have lived experiences with. And so we view God through the lens of our parents or a teacher or a coach or siblings or friends. And my brother was really challenged. We had a really deep conversation of the hardest thing that's been for him is learning to remove God's face from these people.
Yeah.
So his interpretation of God has often been because of his relationships with people he's looked up to. And then when they disappoint him, it's hard for him to disconnect that disappointment from God. And that's a very real and raw thing.
Yeah.
I've had to do that even in my own life, is learning that God's a better father than the best father that we can even imagine. And so if he's better than you think you are, that sometimes the church trauma that it is in our life might be because of a poor theological understanding of what God is, or because we were under a church leadership that misrepresented the heart of the Father. And because this person is the person that helped me find Jesus, so I'm going to put them on this pedestal, like we were saying. And then when they disappoint you or abuse you or manipulate you, it's really hard to find that grace with Jesus again, not because it's hard with Jesus, but because you have portrayed that individual for Jesus.
So
you know
good.
what I'm saying? And again, we're just giving these ideas. These are weeks, months, years of journey.
Yeah, it's a continual. You'll never get away from these things on what to do. And then the last thing we came up with, and we talked about this when we talked about, I don't know if the podcast was called that or not, what kills a soul,
just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, you can look that up. And it's exhaustion, secret keeping, and image management. That kills a soul. So what brings a soul back from the dead? Honesty, connection, and grace. And I'll say this, especially in this idea of church hurt, church trauma, I've also had people that have found themselves in a position where maybe they were really sick. And I'm thinking of a couple different instances, actually. They found themselves sick. They weren't able to come to the gathering. They lost that connection piece. A few of them had to go into hospitalization. And then it come to find out they're really upset, claiming church hurt because the pastor never came and saw them through this. Well, at the end of the day, I had no idea. And I'm just being vulnerable here with some things that I've actually experienced too, where people have claimed church hurt against me. And I legitimately had no idea they were struggling through that at the hospital. And so some people would say, well, that's the pastor. He needs to know what's going on in everybody's life. And if he didn't see somebody for a couple of weeks, he needs to be on the phone calling them or showing up at their house. And so these people are saying, I got hurt by the church because the pastor didn't come see me. But if we go back here to honesty, connection, and grace, and the thing that we talk about the most, we're trying to train people up in such a way where they begin to ask for what they need. You know, people would be there sometimes at a drop of a hat if someone reached out and said, hey, Corey, man, I'm going through a lot. I'm in the hospital now. Could you come by and pray with me? You would be there in 30 minutes that day. Or if you had stuff, I'll be there 8 a.m. the next day. And I think part of it too is people get in these cycles where they had, again, these expectations, and then those expectations went unmet. And then they get into this disappointment. That disappointment turns to all the emotion, the anger, the hurt, the frustration. And not that it's not real, but again, what brings the soul back from the dead? Honesty, connection, and grace.
Yeah.
And sometimes people walk away from the church claiming hurt when being connected to that family and that body is exactly what they need to process through the pain and the hurt on a journey to healing. Now, again, I'm just throwing out that as a caveat, because what we have mentioned a lot is in the form of manipulation, control, some trauma that people have went through. And it's going to be a journey, sometimes a lifelong journey, into a place of healing to build any type of trust back. And we understand that, and I understand that as well.
Yeah, over the next several weeks, we're going to share, in our opinion, some of the biggest things in church leadership that actually creates trauma. We hinted at some of it. We're going to unpack it in a much greater way over the podcast, even probably talking about some things that the church should stop doing. And we're going to be part of that change. So.
Yeah. And again, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We hope you were at least encouraged by the fact we're talking about this, unpacking some of this stuff, and not that I or we have all of this figured out, but we're on a journey, as you said earlier, not to throw away what we have, but to bring reform to the church and the change that I believe that the church actually needs as we move into an area. I believe that it's happening all over the world where people are waking up to how good God is and how good the new covenant kingdom is. And so hopefully as that continues to happen, people will, now it's going to take a while, but move away from the control and abuse done in the name of God.
Yeah. And so hopefully you join us on this journey. Hopefully you, if you've never began that journey of finding freedom and finding a safe space to dialogue with this, hopefully you find your people. If we're one of those people that hurt you, reach out. I'd love to make it right if you give me that opportunity. I'm not saying that I haven't been a part of the system, because I've been a part of the system for over 15 years. But if you also find safety in our house and you want to take that next step, we're available for you. We have a whole counseling wing here at Hill City to help you find healing in your process, because we do realize that it is real, and we want to see you grow, and we want to see you find grace, and we want to see you restored emotionally. And so just know you're loved, and there's nothing you can do about it.